Hello again, and welcome to First Christian Church Adult Fellowship Bible Study. That's the virtual version. This is our seventh lesson in First Maccabees. It covers chapter 6 from verse 1 to the end of it, whatever that is. I think it's 63 or 4, something like that. Where it continues, of course, with this war of civil war and war of Jewish rebellion that's going on, led by Judas Maccabee against the Seleucid king. In today's class, we will see full tilt this issue that we brought up earlier in the class and that scholars have pointed out, that this book of First Maccabees is not written for historical accuracy, but rather to emphasize and propagandize, if we can use that term, of the Maccabee Hasmonean clan. Chapter 6 starts off as if Antiochus IV, the king, has just died, but the facts are that he's been dead for at least a couple of years by this setting, and it's been announced, including there's records to indicate it had even been announced there through the citadel to those people. So it's not that they didn't know that he was dead. These people want us to see it from a different point. So even before this temple was rededicated, and all the battles that we read about in chapter 5 last week, he was dead. All right. The temple rededication was, by the way, recall, December the 14th, 164 BC. And most of the writing events that are going to be in this chapter that we're reading today, historians tell us, are occurring in late 163 and 162 BC. The date of the king's death was October, November, sometime in that moon month of 164 BC, and then it was officially announced in December of 164. So they've got good records to know that this doesn't match, that the story flow here does not match what happened in history. So why does this writer play up his death happening after the temple dedication and after all those battles that we discussed last week? And scholars greatly debate this. You can get about any idea you want as you begin to read some of that. But the most logical and the bulk of the scholarship points towards the idea that this writer wants his reader to think that the king's death was punishment by God for whatever acts he's done towards towards the Jewish people. And the writer wants also, scholars tell us, to model the story very much after Joshua, the story of Joshua in the Old Testament. In other words, kind of matching Judas Maccabee with Joshua. So recall that in that story of Joshua, the old king that was there died, as he was dying, repenting of all of these dastardly deeds that he had done against the chosen people of God, that is, the Israelites. So there's a lot of parallel. That's the point scholars are telling us as we read this. You might note also that Antiochus IV's death description here has many similarities to the story flow that they had in chapter 1 of Alexander the Great's death, especially that part of that story in which they're pointing out that God is intervening to punish. The writer paints a picture of Antiochus here, basically that his work has been undone or thwarted in some way or repaired in those combinations and others through efforts directed by God and carried out through Maccabee as his earthly agent. That's kind of the overall picture without using those words. I mean, the writer doesn't use any of those words. That's what we that's what we pick up from what the scholars say we pick up from the way the story is told. By the way, this story is told very differently and much closer to what the historical record reflects in 2nd Maccabees, although not completely accurate there either. Recall that Antiochus IV had ruled, co-ruled with Lysias, and that Lysias also had with him the king's son, who, after he had been sent to Rome, he then returned for security and support by the southern general Lysias and co-ruler of the kingdom. And this young son's name is Antiochus Eupator, who will become Antiochus V. But before the old fourth Antiochus IV died, he appointed his northern general, not the southern general Lysias, but the northern general Philip, as his replacement leader. The word king's not used, but he is in the role of ruling things. So the young Antiochus Eupator is only 11 years old at this time, but he will move into the kingship by inheritance. And although he is now the new king, in reality Lysias, the southern general and previous co-ruler, is really running things, and that's the person who this story is built around. So it's a political mess that's been left behind by the old king. Based on the story here, the citadel that the Seleucids used to guard the temple and the center of Jerusalem still is occupied by the Seleucids, and they continue to harass these Jews loyal to Maccabee. At the same time, the report shows here that those Jews that are loyal to the Seleucids are being harassed significantly and harshly by the Maccabean Jews. And that's what we should expect, because after all, keep in mind this setting, they're in the middle of a Jewish civil war. So you kind of have two wars going on here. You have the war between the Jews and the Seleucids, but you have an internal Jewish war going on. In fact, this is where many of these parties of people like the Sadducees and Pharisees and Essenes and so forth that we hear about later, all of that comes out of this mess. The people have divided themselves up into major political groups as a result of all this. So Judas leads his people in a siege directly against that citadel. And they describe it here, which scholars date to the spring of 162 BC. And it turns out that this siege is during the land Sabbath year. Not all Jews participate in this event, and those that do not participate are called the ungodly Israelites here in this chapter of the Maccabees. It is these ungodly Israelites who go to the young king and report their bad treatment by the Maccabees to the young king, and I'm sure to Lysias, because Lysias is really running things. Lysias then launches a large army at the Maccabees. But the description of that army, I mean, it's massive, 100,000 troops plus, and it's a big army. It's the way they describe it here. The history shows army wasn't near that big, although it was a significant contingent, uh, to defeat these people finally. So he goes or intends to go there to defeat them. To defend Jerusalem, the Maccabees established a defensive blocking force encampment located at the town of Beth Zachariah, which is located 11 miles more or less due south of Jerusalem, and it sits right on a major approach to coming into the south from Jerusalem. It's awful close. It'd be better if he had a guarding site a little farther out, but that's where, strategically, where it had to be placed. And this was a key approach if you're coming in from the south to attack Jerusalem. So that's where Maccabees are currently holed up, and they're facing Lysias' army, as Lysias, a major army, is coming right towards them. The author has provided us with a very vivid description of what an army looked like in that day and time. He focuses especially on these war elephants, and also on all the glitter around the phalanxes. These phalanxes are infantry units, or the way they march in combat, in which all the spears are pointed out in all directions, and you're totally shield the unit on the outside with this layer of shields. And so that glittering, that movement of these major units, he's describing all that. And he describes that the elephants were made drunk on a wine of mulberry and grape juice. I don't think he uses the word drunk, as I recall, but that's what's going to happen. And at that time of year, that's what form the juice would be in, would be fermented. And so this would have made them drunk, much more aggressive, and particularly because the mulberry juice is in there, they would have had great difficulty. These animals almost go wild, and therefore cause great turmoil. Much more aggressive animal and much more difficult to control. And for those that don't appreciate it, the elephants and war elephants in that day and time would have been the closest thing to a tank you had on a battlefield. And anyone's ever been around a battle with tanks involved with it, the mental mindset is a totally different game. And so this is a major combat event. It appears that the Jews then ambush the advance guard of the Seleucid army and create heavy casualties for the Seleucids. But that's based on the history, based on what you've got here. I'm sure that's the advance guard, and scholars point to that. And then the Jews withdraw, the Maccabees withdraw to Jerusalem. Now, essentially, they've been defeated in that little battle, but this word defeat never gets used here. This writer is not going to present any kind of picture that displays the Maccabees in any sort of defeated role. So maybe the better term for us to use here is it's a strategic withdrawal to the walls of Jerusalem. During the battle, one of Judas's brothers shows great personal courage and bravery. This is Eleazar. When he goes under a royal battle elephant and spears it, he is killed when the animal falls or collapses on him. Essentially, this would have been an act of self-sacrifice. It's the only one that's mentioned, is that self-sacrifice. I'm convinced, and other people reading this, that have any kind of military experience, they're convinced that surely there were other self-sacrifices, but there's no mention of it. The only people who are being bragged on are the Maccabees. The Seleucids march on and place the city of Jerusalem under siege. The ultimate outcome is not in question. That size army putting the town of Jerusalem under siege. Ultimately, the sieging army is going to win. But that's if mankind is in charge. But as the story is written here, mankind is not the only one fighting. God is on the side of the Maccabees. But the ultimate outcome, with God intervening here, is very interesting from a theological standpoint, because it's different from the normal thing that happens. The Seleucids are unable to stay, even though they've got this big, massive army, easily can overpower this place. It's just a matter of getting their siege machines in time and place and tearing this place down. But they can't sustain themselves in Judah due to the fact that there's a man-made famine going on. Why the man-made famine? The Jews are in the middle of a land Sabbath year. They're obedient to this law of laying the land aside. And that's not just one farmer doing it on his 7th year. This is a 7th year national cycle, and no land is to be cultivated and no harvest is to be taken. They live strictly on stored food reserves. And they didn't store up enough food reserves for a 100,000 man army coming in. That large army would have quickly consumed such stored food reserves through their foraging forays, and I'm sure those would have been going on. So both sides are now out of food, creating quite a serious situation of survival. So the famine is created through obedience to God's law. It's the concept that's being laid out here without actually using those words. So they describe the tricky piece then that's going to be that's there, that's going to happen as a result of this famine. Scholars say this is the piece, though, that Antiochus IV actually had developed before he died. But there's no mention of that here by this writer. What really drives the pull out of Lysis out of the area, though, scholars say, is that he has a much bigger fish to fry, in that a civil war now has broken out within their empire, in that before the old king died, instead of naming his co-ruler as the new leader, he appoints the general who he was with in the north. He may not have had any choice. He may have been a sick man on his bed. That's what many scholars would say. And so he appoints him under duress, possibly. And that's a possibility. But the point is that the person who has the king's son with him is not named as the new leader, and also furthermore, he was the co-ruler. So he then heads out. This general's name was Philip. So Lysis heads out of Jerusalem and goes to address this issue that's developed as a result of the wrong person, so to speak, being named king. And so he heads back to the capital in Antioch and defeats Philip after a significant civil war event that goes on, as well as several other generals that were involved. And that's according to the history of Josephus. Lysis consolidates power for the young king by defeating these other generals and Philip. And then he remains as the military commander. The writer in 1 Maccabees gives the idea that the Seleucids are finally forced to negotiate with the Maccabee Hasmonean group here through a combination of military strength and God's intervention with this famine, and the famine being the result of obedience of God's law. But afterwards, the Seleucids are really still in charge. As we finish that chapter, they're still in charge. There's not much mention of that, but clearly that's the case. The Jews do not. The Jews have earned some religious freedom, which is important to them, and they've lived for centuries with just the religious freedom, which was enough for them. But that citadel is still there, occupied by Seleucids. This was clearly a near total defeat for the Maccabees. Of anything they've dealt with so far, that's the closest to a real defeat, and I think that's a point we need to keep in mind. So we should expect the war to continue in these future chapters to some level for two reasons. Because I'm sure the Seleucids are not happy with the solution they've ended up with temporarily, and they'll take care of that later probably. But more importantly, you've still got a civil war going on within Judea, in that most Jews just want it left alone. You have that minority that's supporting strongly the Maccabees, and then you have those that are still loyal to the Seleucids. So that hasn't resolved. That part has not resolved itself. So we expect to see those discussed in future chapters. And as you study this, spend some time thinking about this issue, theological issue that is surface here, is that what happens when we're obedient to God's law? What are the future outcomes of being obedient to God's laws? Hope you have a good study this week, and we'll see you at this time next week.